Folly Cove. It's just been wonderful. During my gathering of objects for the treasure trove, I happened upon Isabel, and I asked her if she would loan us the original diploma that Virginia Lee Burton did for Sarah Elizabeth. And she was more than happy to. I'm going to need some water. And that's what happened. And a couple of weeks later, I was over speaking with her, and I said, Isabel, how would you like to do a talk at the Innisquam Exchange? And she said, oh, I would love to. And I didn't even twist her arm. Not much. So here we are. I asked Isabel to give me a little background, and I'd be happy to do so. We have some little chairs, and
I'm going to get out of the way here.
Can you go downstairs behind the door? There's 6 folding chairs.
I want to move this a little so that more people can have a place to sit down. I'm putting this.
Isabel Natti was born American here on Cape Ann at Addison Gilbert Hospital. Her mother was a New York City summer boarder, Yankee. Her grandfathers had fought each other in the Civil War, loyal West Virginian versus Jackson, Mississippi, and her father was a Lanesville Finn. Isabel's mother had come with her family to summer in Pigeon Cove, Rockport. Her father, Paul Manship, had friends on Cape Ann, including the sculptors Walter Hancock, George Demetrios, and K. Lane Weems of Manchester by the Sea. Paul was looking for a place for a summer home, and Lanesville was the choice, especially after his eldest daughter married a local man. His summer house opened the year his first granddaughter was born. Jimmo Ilmari Natti was the local Finn who married Ms. Manship. By the time his daughter Isabel was born, in addition to working to support his young family, he had translated the Kalevala from Finnish to English and had made a series of linoleum block prints to illustrate his tale. Isabel was born into a community with rural roots of farmers, craftsmen, and fishermen, with the leavening of artists at an international level of excellence. The Natti family itself was an extraordinary group of teachers, musicians, and artists. Growing up in Lanesville in the mid-20th century exposed Isabel to the presumption that women did what they wanted and were creative people. As a child, she was eager to participate and asked her father to teach her how to cut linoleum. All the ladies did it. Jimmo was a wonderful teacher with a vast knowledge of nature, so Isabel inadvertently learned a lot about these things as well as how to cut lino. Isabel started school at the Lane School. Her family moved to New York City, where she attended public school until graduation from City College of New York, uptown. After living a year in Florida and a year in California, she returned to Lanesville to care for her 80-year-old grandmother. Isabel married John Tuck of Rockport in 1977, and they had one son. After 17 years, they divorced. Isabel then married Italo Canoni, who she had met in Rome, Italy in 1966. In 1974, Sarah Elizabeth Holleran established a block printing shop at Whistle Stop Mall in Rockport. She had acquired the Acorn press Ano Natti had at the Folly Cove Designers barn and was working to make blocks to print and sell as cards and placemats and fabric to order. It happened that Isabel came by and fell into it, and she continues carving and printing to this day. Isabel.
Thank you.
You're welcome, dear.
Well, after all that, I don't know what to say. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for all coming, and thank you, Kathy, for saying all those wonderful things that we invented. in fact, I cut linoleum, and so there's two parts to this story. One part is, why do I do this? And the other part is, how do I do this? And I think I'll start with why I do it, because that's easier. That my dad cut linoleum. This is a picture of his horses. And this is the woods. And this is the stone crusher that was up there at the end of Quarry Street. And this is a working quarry that was there. I don't know which one. And so he was doing that before I was born. At around that period, Ginny started her classes of design, that she made this agreement with the musician, and then she started these classes. And as far as I can understand, the Natti family en masse took these courses. They all took them. I think Uncle Eno might have said, you have to go to Ginny's courses. In any case, my dad took the courses, and his special interest was in plants. And this is an example of one of the blocks that he had. And one of the things that the Folly Cove designers taught is you make a design, you repeat the design, and you simplify it. And this must have been an exercise in that you make a design, you make variations on the design, and you lead to simplifying it. In any case, I'm not sure which is a simple one. But it's all variations on the same thing. So when I was little, I grew up with this around me. This was normal. And so that's why at a certain point, I asked my dad, show me how to cut lino. And in those days, grown-ups didn't have any problem with children using knives and sharp things. And so I cut lino. And so this is one of my dad's blocks. And this is a good example of the early Folly Cove design thesis. This is a print from that block. And just by itself, the print of the block doesn't amount to much. But when you reflect it, and reflect the reflection, and repeat it, then you get something else, you see. And that was one of the things that a series of the thesis of what makes a good design is this reflection and repetition and symmetry, because the human likes symmetry. And the other thing my dad is teaching with this design is two things. The printed part is a dandelion, that you don't have to go somewhere special to find something beautiful and inspirational. You just need to open your eyes wherever you are, and there are these things all around you. And the other thing is, when you're making a design, the part that's cut away is just as important as the part that's printing. And this, you can see that very dramatically, because the white part of the design makes a very dramatic design. Now this lino block is just the linoleum. But I print with a block that's attached to plywood, so I'll tell you how I do that. I get the piece of plywood. This is a card and a piece of linoleum, and I put Elmer's glue wall on there. And I put Elmer's glue wall on here. And then I put it together, and I put a piece of newspaper on the floor and put the block down, glue side up, and the block glue side down. And then I get all the heavy things I can find, the dictionary, rocks, whatever, till I can make it, leave it to stick there. And then I get the block glued on, and I would warm the linoleum. That's a hint number one. When you cut linoleum, warm it. And then I can trim off this little extra edge, which then gives me the card block that I'm going to work with. Once you have the block, or even before you have the block, you need to have your drawing. And for this, I started with a drawing a simple drawing of a quilt square. And once I got that drawing, I took this piece of plastic and I put it on top of the drawing and I copied it with a magic marker, the kind of magic marker that doesn't smear. You've got to be careful of that. Make sure you get one of those really permanent ones. Because then what I want to do, when this is my transfer sheet, I want to take a piece of carbon paper, which people of a certain young age have no clue what this is. And so I put a carbon face onto the block. Then I take my transfer and I put it upside down onto the block, and I would tape that into place. And then I would copy the design from the plastic, and then it would come out onto the linoleum block. And then I take that magic marker again and I color in everything that I'm going to cut. And the reason I color in everything that I'm going to cut is I understood at a certain point that if you're printing black or dark blue or something, it doesn't matter if there's black magic marker on the block. But if you're printing yellow or some pink or something, and the magic marker, the black, is on the block, the ink can dissolve some of that black and make it bleed into the print. So to avoid that, I color in the part that's going to cut. Because then once I finish cutting, there's no more magic marker, just clean linoleum. Then I have to put this carbon paper away because it's a beast. And so once I get it all colored in, I start carving. And my carving is done. The first thing I would do before I start carving is I'd find the center of the back and put a upholstery tack there. Because when you put an upholstery tack, the thing will spin when you put it on the table. You can spin it. And I need to spin it because I'm cutting with an X-Acto knife. And I'm going to cut one side of the line, and then I'm going to turn it and cut the other side of the line to take out a V-shaped piece of linoleum. And I'll do that to carve the whole design. Where there's a big place like this is where I would use a gouge. I'd outline it by cutting with the X-Acto knife and then take out the big pieces with the gouge. And then I have a little brush which I would brush my crumbs when I work. So that's my tool kit. And then I have the completed block, and then when I print it, there's the print. So that's how I make a linoleum block.
Excuse me. When you go to carve, do you heat it, or do you just heat it?
Whenever I'm going to cut it, I heat it.
And how do you heat it?
I usually put it in the window in the sun.
Cool.
If there's no sun in the window, there's an electric heater, and I have a piece of slate that I put there, and then I'll put that linoleum down there just because I don't want it to get too hot. Because if it's too hot and you try and cut it, the linoleum will rip instead of cutting. And if it's too cold, then the knife will skid, and that's when people cut themselves because they think they're cutting rock, which you don't have to cut rock with linoleum if you warm it up. So the difference between these card blocks and the blocks of the placemats is only the size of the block. The way to make it is the same. This is Sarah Elizabeth's signature block that she made in 1974 when she opened the Sarah Elizabeth shop. And in fact, Sarah Elizabeth died just a few weeks ago. She was 92 years old. And she worked at the shop until she was 87. And then she told me I had to keep it open. And I had been saying, yes, boss, for all 30 years already. So at that point I said, yes, boss. And so that's what I do. One of the things that the single block, you get a single color print. But if you want multiple colors, for instance, this is a 2-color. And the way you make a two-color is you make two blocks, you see. This is the block that's going to print in orange, which I would print. Then I let the orange dry, and then this one will print in black, and then I'll print the black one on top and get the two-color print that way. With the black covers the orange because it's so dense. With my Squam Wood series, I have 4 blocks, which I can print in any combination and any colors, whatever I want to do. And when I print them, I print with a transparent ink so that the overlapping colors make another color instead of just one color. With the placemats I normally print, I use an opaque base because it carries the color better and you get a denser color because there must be little tiny round things of chalk or something in the base, and so the pigment covers them, so when you print it makes the print covers. And so those are the 2 kinds of ink that I get. I buy the 2 different kinds of bases, and then I buy pigments and I mix them to make the colors I want. So I brought an example of the Squam Woods when you're printing multiple colors. And the way I ended up being at the Sarah Elizabeth shop is the Folly Cove designers had gone out of business, and that thing had ended in 1969 when they disbanded, and those blocks weren't to be printed anymore. And Sarah Elizabeth had gotten her diploma with Ginny in 1942, so she had been already 27 years with the Folly Cove designers. And in 1974, she was in a position of being unemployed. She had worked as the personnel manager at Brown's, and Brown's went out of business at a certain point, and so she was unemployed, and her boyfriend, Bob Hendrick from Marblehead, said, well, why don't you start a card shop and cut that linoleum like you used to do, because you liked doing that. And then if that weren't a good enough poke, he said, and I'll give you a couple $1,000 to get started. At that point where she was unemployed, she thought, let's do it. She had her own press. I think it was called a Washington press, a straight-sided press. And so she rented the shop at Whistle Stop Mall. She could have rented it some other place, but the rent was very good at Whistle Stop Mall, and it was very convenient because there was parking spaces, and so it seemed like a good idea. And she moved in there, and I guess she must have moved in the beginning of the year and started carving cards, and she made the twin lights and started the urban removal block. And meanwhile, after she had done this, my Uncle Ano had heard about her doing this, and it was his press that had been at the Folly Cove Designers Barn, beautiful acorn press from a graduate school library in Harvard, as far as I understood. And so he had gotten in touch with Sarah Elizabeth and offered her this acorn press, and she had said, great, because her press apparently had a cracked platen or some other bad condition, and she was delighted to get the good press. So they moved that in. And my uncle kept saying to me, oh, there's this lady who started a block printing shop in Rockport. You ought to go over there and help her. And I said, I don't think so, because I understood from looking at his life, nobody's getting rich making block prints, and I had more ambitions than that. But it happened that one day I was walking down the street in Rockport, and I saw the press in the shop, and so I entered, and I said, what are you doing with my uncle's press? Having forgotten what my uncle told me. And she said, well, I'm block printing. And being very young and arrogant, I said, oh, I can do that too. So we ended up having a long conversation, which ended up with Sarah Elizabeth saying, well, bring along a block. At that point, I was in the trap. I had to go home and make a block, because I couldn't have done all that bragging and then not, come back with the goods. And so she was very clever. I brought a block, and she said, oh, that's very good. make another one. So, okay, make another one. And she showed me how to use the press. And at that point already I was a little trapped in the thing. Uncle Eno was still alive, and I told him about it, and he gave me a big block that he said, oh, I was going to use this for my next design, but where the designers is out of business, I have nothing to do with it. Here, you take it. So then I started designing my first big block, which was a lobster's. And then the years just went by. That I kept my day job. I'd work on Saturdays, and if I had printing to do, I might come in the evening. And as Sarah Elizabeth got older and my life circumstances changed, I began spending more time there. And pretty soon I was spending all my time there. And I told her kids, listen, if I'm here, because she was already getting old, if I'm here and I have to spend all my time taking care of your mother, you're going to have to give me some money so I don't starve. And so they agreed, and so sort of behind their backs they made a contribution to me, and so that Libby could keep me there as their local slave and not realize quite that what was going on. And then time went by, and we regrouped it, and she understood that she needed a caretaker, and so we put the whole thing above board. And so she was there for another X number of years, and then 5 years ago she retired because she felt she was no longer able to take care of herself. And she had been in the nursing home for rehabilitation, and she remembered they take good care of you in there, and they're nice, and they feed you on time, and they help you with everything. So she wanted to be taken care of, and she went in then to Denmark, where she lived until this summer. And so then I'm staying at the shop. One of the things my Uncle Eno told me, that when he was trying to convince me that I should go into this business, he said, looked in a kind of a faraway look in his eyes, he said, I've had a good life as a printer. And so I always think of that, well, a good life is a worthy thing to seek. And so he's right, because the sort of people who would come into the shop who are interested in block printing, it seems to me already they're a much nicer bunch of people than the ones who just keep walking by. And so at that point you've already sort of made a selection of who you're going to meet. And you don't randomly meet people, you only meet these people who are interested in things like this. And they're very interesting people of all sorts, artists and historians and people who are just interested in art, and just a big selection of people who normally I would never meet. And so that makes for a good life, meeting all those people. And the other thing is, I know that it only takes me 5 minutes or 10 minutes to tell all about how to make the blocks and everything. So I brought some of my father's block prints to show you how I fell into this thing. Because when I grew up, my parents lived in the woods, and my mother had been a debutante in New York City, and her father was trying to marry her off, and he didn't have any success because she didn't like any of those men at all. And then she came up here and she met my dad, and he lived in the woods. He had a chicken farm, and he had lived in a house he had made himself, and there was no electricity, there was no running water, there was an outhouse in the yard. And when my mother fell in love with him, she decided she would go live under those circumstances to be with him, because that's what she preferred than the wealth of the city. One of her friends from the city gave them an artesian well for wedding presents. So they had running water in the house with a pump that you had to remember to keep some water to prime the pump in the morning. I was just a little kid. Everybody else took all care of all of these things. I just observed. Kerosene lamps, they were good. And my father was very interested in nature, so that he knew all the trees and all the birds and all the lives of all of these things, because he had studied those things as a kid. When he was little and growing up, there was a old man who used to come to Cape Ann who went into the woods to gather herbs and things in the swamps. And he got too old to go there himself. And so he needed a boy to carry his bags of greens and to help him when he got stuck in a hole or whatever he was doing. And my dad was the one who got volunteered for this position, I guess, because he was, the Natties were a big family. There were 12 in the family, so you could pick which one was about right. And my dad was interested in the right age to do this, so that he learned a lot about nature and the plants and all kinds of things like that. So I grew up thinking all adults knew all the birds and all the trees, because if I went to my other relatives, they knew all those things too, that it seemed normal. And if you talked to Jenny or George or any of those people, it was normal to know those things. And so I grew up learning about all those things. But in any case, these are some of my dad's block prints. Here's some people entering or leaving a room. This is probably one of the Kalevala illustrations. And this I brought because it's outrageous that it's a face. And this is another face. But one of the other things my dad did that was unusual was when he was growing up, he took lessons in the Finnish language. Normally, the kids learned the Finglish at home, and then they learned English in school, and the original language was lost. But my dad went to summer school with a teacher to learn how to read and write in Finnish, which put him in the position to do the translation of the Kalevala. This is Väinämöinen, and Väinämöinen is the singer who sang the verses of the Kalevala, knew all the magic that is told about in the story.
Isabel, what's the Kalevala?
The Kalevala is the epic of Finland. It's a poem. It was collected in 1830 by Elias Lundrot, who was a physician, and he went out in the summer to these villages all around Finland, and he transcribed the songs, the traditional songs that the people sang. Because before there was written books, history was transmitted by stories and song works better than stories, because song, you can remember both the melody and the words. And the Kalevala was made for remembering, because everything it says, it always says it 3 times. That the bird sat in the tree, the robin was in the bush, the magpie was in the pine. Whatever it is, different ways to remember the same idea. And that's because when the only way you're going to know it is by remembering what the words were, that you need to have a way of doing that. This is one of the singers also. I don't know if this is, I think this must be the man who's singing about Väinämöinen and telling the story, because he looks like a singer. And here's one of the faces of one of the warriors of those times. The Kalevala talks about the origins of life, that Väinämöinen was the first man, and he was born of the water maiden and the being of the sky, and that she was pregnant for 700 years and thrashed. Imagine, she thrashed a lot, and where her head hit the shore, that's where the beaches are, and where her heel struck into the ground, that's where the fjords are. And so that's how the world was created. And when Väinämöinen was born, the world was mud, which, if you think about it, that puts the history back to the melting of the glaciation when that part of the world was mud. Because the first thing Weinemarinnen had to do was plant a lot of trees. And being a story, when he needed to plant trees, he was the first person, the first being in the world. But when he needed to plant trees, he went and got the neighbor's gardener to do the work. But these stories, you can't have total logic. And then there were people like river gods who were part of the story, who did various things. And this is a fellow called Lemminkainen. And Lemminkainen was a great grief to his mother because he was very attractive. You can see all the ladies looking at him. He was willing. And the husbands didn't like it. And so he kept getting chased out of one village. The men would come after him, probably with knives. In any case, and finally he got killed and cut in pieces and thrown in the river, and it was really a big problem. His mother had to come, and first she had to plant a lot of linen, and then she had to weave a lot of twine so she could make a net so she could get the pieces out of the river. And then she had to sing a lot of songs, and she had to stitch the nerves back together and stitch the blood vessels back together and make a lot of lotions and potions and enchantments. And finally she got him put back together and went home with him. But meanwhile, the people in the neighborhood had burnt their home down because Lemminkainen was a big pest. And the story doesn't get better. More bad things happen. In any case, Lemminkainen was one of the handsome people. But this man, Kullervo was this man's name. And Kullervo, his story is just a disaster. And everything is wrong. His parents are killed. He gets sent away to work as an indentured servant. He hates his masters. His masters hate him. He gets sold to somebody else. He kills his employer's wife. He runs away, and he tries to go back home to his village, and he runs into his sister. He doesn't know it's his sister, and he rapes her. And then he ends up that she commits suicide because she finds it's her brother who did it. And then he commits suicide when he finds out it was his sister. And so this guy had a really hard time. So in the Kalevala, it describes all sorts of people, which is why it fascinated my father so much to translate it, that if you lived alone in a village, you wouldn't have a chance to meet a variety of people. But through these stories, you got to see that the world is filled with people of all sorts. And the same kind of people are around in any civilization, in any age. There's people behave in certain ways, and that's what happens. Now this is Ilmarinen. He was the smith, that he knew how to use iron, which was a big thing. You can see he's a very big guy. But he's courting a lady. This is the lady's mother. And she says to him, well, you need to go into the back field and plow the field and plant the barley. And she says, well, you may run into some snakes there. Well, the fact is the field was all full of snakes. It was a disaster. Anybody who went there ended up being dead. But the girl he's courting, of course, thinks this is a nice one. She tells him the secret of how to be able to plow the field and plant the barley. He wins her. Ilmarinen wins the girl in the end, and that's the one that Kullervo ends up killing. In any case, and here's another one of I don't know what they're planning to do. But one of the things it says is young men at a certain age get a little bored. And at that point what they need to do is go to war. And it also suggests if you can't find a war, you can always start one. And so that doesn't seem to change either. In any case, the only other picture I have is this one, which is a repeating pattern for chicken. If you keep going, actually it's rooster. If you keep printing them, they run around in a circle, as you can see. And then just to let you know that I'm now famous. This is a Japanese magazine that's just a September issue about Virginia Lee Burton Demetrius and her 100th birthday. And your picture's in here too. Patty's picture is in here. But in addition to saying all the things about the little house and Ginny and the designers and everything like that, you see, you don't need to do Japanese to be able to read this. The pictures tell the story. That they did a whole page here about myself, you see, and the Sarah Elizabeth shop. So I'm very proud of that. That's why I'm showing it to you. And I even got it translated, and it says more or less just what you would expect it to say. So I don't know what else I can say, but I can answer questions, and I don't know how much about that was about block printing and how much was about something else, but in any case.
How do you clean your prints?
Well, when I'm finished printing, I have some kerosene, and I put the kerosene, and I take the threads that I've pulled out from the fringe to absorb the kerosene when I'm done to dry the block. And then I have an old toothbrush, and after I've done that once, I do it again and scrub it with the toothbrush, and then take the fringe pieces, the pieces of threads, and dry it. And then eventually the block, from all the printing, it starts getting crushed, that the little fine lines start going away, and the thin lines that are printing start getting thick. And so then I have to recut to reopen the small lines and to thin the detail lines.
You start a new one, or you just...
No, I just work again on the old one to clean it up. Yes.
Is that Battleship Gray Linoleum?
Well, yes, it is called Battleship Linoleum, and I buy it from an art supply store that, I can't even think of the name of it, it's on my website, but I think I used to get it from Saks, but now I get it from a different person, and I buy it in 36-inch squares so that I can cut to the size I want, because you can't really get blocks this size. It's 11 by 17 is what we use for the placemats.
Do you have to have a press to do the blocks?
You don't have to have a press, but if you do have a press, you get a better print. With the cards, you can ink the block, and then you can put the piece of paper onto the block this way, and with a wooden spoon, go like this over it again and again, and when you think you really did it enough times, do it a little more, and be sure you get the edges, and you can get a very good print that way. The other way you can print is how the Folly Cove designers printed originally, and that is put some newspaper to make a little padding on the floor, and then you put down the thing you want to print, and you put the block on it, and you jump on it. Which you can get a good print, but not as good as the press. And it's a lot of work to do all that jumping on the thing. But that's what they did before they got presses. The Folly Cove designers, in the 30 years they were in existence, had about 40 members. And they, just about all of them had their own presses, because the quality of the print was so much superior. And the ones that didn't have presses would go down to the barn and print with the demonstration press, my uncle's acorn press, or they'd have a friend among the designers and go to their friend's house and print.
Do you run into issues when it's humid, like the ink drying? Do you get into any?
Well, if it's raining a lot, I prefer not to print. A day like this is perfect for printing. In the winter, when it's cold, it's a problem. What I do is I have, underneath the glass that I use to spread the ink, I have some heating element that's normally used in snake cages. It's a little flat strip of, I don't know, plastic, I don't know what it is, but it heats just a little tiny bit, just enough so the snake doesn't get too cold, but not enough so it could burn anything. So it's a very low heat. And it has a little rheostat on it that my friend set up for me. And that in the winter I have to put that on to warm the ink. Because if the ink is cold, you can't get a thin coat of it, that you get all clumpy, and then it fills in all the details immediately. Whereas if it's warmer, then it's thinner and you can get a smooth coating. So the printing is best in the summer. And then when it's cold in the winter, it takes much longer to dry. That it'll take, usually I say 24 hours to dry. On a day like this, it might, dry in 15 hours. In the cold of winter, when the shop might be, 60 degrees when I turn the heat down, it may be 2 days to dry. And the black ink dries much slower than, say, the orange ink. So that all of these things are a little peculiar. They all have their own peculiarities.
Are you allowed to print any of the original Folly Cove people things, or all of what you do is your own?
What I do is my own work. That was the first lesson of the Folly Cove designers. Do your own work. So I'm sticking with that.
Could you, if you wanted to? I mean, are there
Well,
copyrights?
Well, the copyrights must be long since gone.
Yeah.
In fact, I inherited Isabel Natti's blocks. So I personally have all of his blocks. But what I've done with them is I've given them to the Sandy Bay Historical Association, and they have them there in their vault. And I told them, here, you can have them, but if I want to borrow one to print, I can do that. And I would never print them to sell for my profit. Some years ago, I printed his squirrels in cooperation with the Cape Ann Historical Association. It was a special printing. I don't know what it was, raising funds for something or doing some celebration of some years gone by kind of a thing. And I printed a limited set of that squirrel's print for that event. And it's possible in the future that for some special event that I would take one of his blocks and print it for that event. Because they decided that none of those blocks would be printed as Folly Cove again, or sold publicly as Folly Cove again. If my brother asked me to print my uncle's blocks for him, I would do that, because I'm not selling them. I'm doing it for the family, which is private, which is permitted as far as I'm concerned. But I would never print them to sell. First off, it's not my work, that I prefer to print my own work. They did their work, I'll do my work, is my theory.
What happened to all the other blocks?
Well, there were about 40 different artists in the Folly Cove designers. Each one of those artists has disposed of their blocks in whatever way they saw fit. Whether they gave them to a museum, they gave them to their heirs, they gave them to their friend, and they're hanging them on the wall. Their heirs took them and threw them in the trash bin because they didn't know what they were. I don't know where they are, but each family has dealt with that in their own way. One of the reasons it's very important that when they ended the printing, they ended it and said, this is it. Because of this thing of when the block gets to be used a lot, you get that crushing, and then you get a lousy print. And the Folly Cove designers didn't do lousy prints. They did perfect prints. And if it wasn't good, you couldn't sell it as Folly Cove. With me, I'm a little more let the buyer beware here. If there's a thumbprint or a bad, if it's not too bad, it's in stock, and the person who's buying it can look at it. Some people say, well, it's handmade, don't you have something with the thumbprint? Sure, okay, you want proof, you want the fingerprint on it, go for it. So, to each his own. But if it were someone else's block, and you started getting bad prints, you would diminish the work of the Folly Cove designers. And if you cut it to clean it out, then it would be, start being secondary work. With the designs that Sarah Elizabeth made, when she retired and told me to keep the shop open, she gave me permission to continue printing her blocks. And even before she died, especially